To introduce tonight's speaker, I would like to call on Dr. William Perez. Dr. Perez is an immigrant from El Salvador and first-generation college graduate. He is a professor at the School of Education here at LMU. His research focuses on the civic engagement, multilingualism, and academic resilience of immigrant, undocumented, indigenous, and deported students in the U.S. and Mexico. He has received various awards for his community-engaged research from the American Educational Research Association, the Association for the Study of Higher Education, the American Educational Studies Association, the Fulbright Scholars Program, and most recently, the 2023 LMU Award for Excellence in Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. The impact of his scholarship has been recognized by Education Week's annual ranking of the top university-based scholars in the U.S. who are doing the most to influence educational policy and practice. We're very happy to call on him tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Rhonda, for that generous introduction, and I can't tell you what a pleasure it is to have the opportunity to introduce one of our shining stars in the School of Education, Dr. Cynthia Alcantar. I mean, I couldn't believe when she said yes when we were in the process of hiring, and she agreed to come to LMU to share groundbreaking work, which you're going to hear about in more detail tonight. So let me tell you, before you hear about her work on civic engagement, a little bit about sort of what drives, sort of what's behind all of that particular focus. And it's the important thing that I want to highlight about Dr. Alcantar is that there's only one piece of her entire research agenda, which is groundbreaking in itself because it's raising questions that we never asked before related to access and equity in new and innovative ways. So first, let me start by saying that Dr. Alcantar is an associate professor and director in the Master's in Higher Education and Administration program in the School of Education. Her research focuses on the social structures that impact the social mobility and integration of racial, ethnic, minoritized, and immigrant populations in the United States. Her most current work examines how minority-serving institutions and community colleges impact the educational pathways and civic participation of racial, ethnic, and minoritized immigrant students. Dr. Alcantar's research is strongly informed by her professional and personal experiences. Dr. Alcantar is a proud first-generation college student and daughter of Mexican immigrants who grew up in the Inland Empire of Southern California. She also has extensive experience working with underserved students in K-12 and higher education settings, including the Upward Bound program at Norco Community College, the McNair Scholars Program at Claremont Graduate University. She was a track coach at Norte Vista High School and an English and math instructor at John Adams Elementary School in Riverside, California. She received her bachelor's from the University of University of California, Riverside, and her master's from Claremont Graduate University, and her PhD in social sciences and comparative education from the University of California, Los Angeles. It is my great pleasure to welcome and invite Dr. Cynthia Alcantar to speak to us about her work on civic engagement. Thank you.
All right. So thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you, Rhonda. Thank you to the entire team. I mean, thank you to the folks that are working here at Handle, but also, I mean, we have an amazing staff that has helped prepare and set up the room as well. So I want to thank you, and videographer and everything. Hi, YouTube world, and anybody else who watches it. So thank you for having me and for the invitation to even come and engage. I kept getting asked before this date, like as I was meeting different folks, like, how do you feel about this? I was like, I'm kind of nervous. Like, and not that I've never spoken to a large crowd, but it's mostly like, oh my God, I almost feel like this is my real formal introduction into LMU wide, groups. And so thank you for having me and thank you for engaging with me in my work. And I hope you find some connections in terms of your own experiences here at LMU. I know majority of the folks here are, we have a lot of students, both graduate, my students are here, representing. And then we also have undergraduate students represented from School of Ed, but also other majors. So thank you for those faculty who graciously made sure that they brought the students here. I also want to give a shout out to my husband, one of my other key supporters here, and who drove from Long Beach, I don't know. Let's not ask how fast, but he's here and made it right on time. And thank you all for having me and everybody who has been kind of interconnected with my work in some ways. So again, I got invited to present on this particular publication, and so I don't expect that everybody read it. I'm not about to ask you questions like details about the publication, but I wanted to highlight it just in case like you're curious after this talk. Hey, I didn't get to read it yet, but hey, let me check it out. So here's some of the information about it, and I'm going to give you a bit of a preview, but I want us to step back just a little bit so that we're all on the same page when we're talking about civic engagement. And here I'm going to bring in my instructor hat and my and engage you all in kind of this learning process. And I want to kind of hear, knowing that we have different folks represented, different folks that engage with communities, with classrooms, with students in different ways. I want to get your take on civic, like when you hear the word civic engagement, and don't cheat like the folks who already read the article. Please don't be that, you already know, I know. Where we're headed with this. But I want to know, just from folks, you haven't read it, you're hearing this word, it's a language that we hear, especially around this time as we're leading into like some big elections coming up, right? And so when you hear civic engagement, what do you think of? Like, what is it? And feel free to you don't have to do this, just tell me. Is there particular words, ideas, experiences that you think of as related? Wow, everybody read the article. Politics, thank you. Anybody else? Voting. What else?
Activism.
Great. What else?
Community service.
Great. He does work on civic engagement, so you're kind of so listen to the different key words that we just heard, right? So politics, voting, activism, right? There's a lot of key words that are often thrown around, and in the literature of civic engagement, you find that too. Like some people will focus solely on voting, some folks will focus specifically voting and political engagement, but there has been other works, and sometimes they don't call it civic engagement, but activism, community engagement, they're all interrelated, and that's my definition. And I actually draw from some of the work of Dr. Perez, whose work informed my interest in this, because if you were to have asked me as an undergrad, are you civically engaged? And I'll get to like more about me in just a minute, but I would have said, well, no, but let me tell you some more about it. So I broadly define it as, and this is a key, quote taken out and out of the article, and I bolded Dr. Perez's article where he specifically cites civic engagement, but it's individual actions that positively impact the public good of our society, including political, social, community engagement, such as participating in protests and organizing. Sometimes you hear the rhetoric around, and I highlight those two in particular because often there's times where protest and organizing, activism is seen as like an anti-democratic political ways to engage, but that's all civic engagement. Like we want to be able to promote those types of things, and so I wanted to make sure that we highlight that that's also civic engagement. It also includes, it includes varied forms of activism, both formal and informal volunteering, working on elected campaigns, voting, working in community-based nonprofits, translating for one's community, mentoring, coaching youth, all these different things that are encompassing what may be civic behaviors of folks, whether it's students or others. And so there has been a lot of research around civic engagement, and what I'm kind of alluding to, that it has had a particular focus on political engagement. But what we do know, so let's talk a little bit about what we do know, and forgive me, I didn't put all my citations. I had to switch from Canvas over to PowerPoint last minute. If you want a citation, happy to share those with you. And so what we do know, higher education institutions are critical sites at promoting the civic development of college students through civic pedagogies. I am intentionally using civic development and not civic engagement. Civic engagement is a behavior, like what I'm actually doing. Whereas the development, there's different factors that come into play when we look at civic development. So it's not just the engagement, that's one component. But we don't, for the most part, folks don't wake up or and are like, oh yeah, I'm gonna go join a protest today. Something happened along the way, whether it was a personal experience, whether it's they got motivated, they got inspired by someone. Maybe it was a peer who's gonna go and I'm gonna be invited and I'm gonna go. Sometimes you are raised in families where that is a part of the family culture and the family things that you do, is being involved with different things. And so, but we do want to, I want to recognize that it's a development. And as good higher education researchers, practitioners, we want to know that what we do in higher education has an impact that helps with the development of folks and the way that they engage communities. What we also know is that students are have varying levels of civic engagement, and that gets to that idea of the development. So they are all coming with something, but there might be, so some folks come to campuses and they are ready to engage in activism and organizing and so forth. Others come that they had an experience that they know was wrong, but they have yet to find the language to really identify what needs to be changed or done. So you have different folks that are coming with different ideas around civic engagement. We also know that there's differences in terms of civic engagement outcomes by racial, ethnic groups. So Latinx students will engage differently. So outcomes in terms of how they actually engage. We know that the experiences of going to college at the end of 4 years, and this is part of my dissertation study. After the engaging with colleges after 4 or 5 years, there is a difference by different racial groups, and it is impacted by different types of higher education institutions. We also know the critical role of educators, and I'm using educators broadly. These are administrators, this is actual faculty, this is staff, but it's also folks that we interact with on a daily with higher education institutions. Just recently, I think it was just last week, I was talking to one of the maintenance staff, and he was schooling me on some of the civic actions that were happening amongst the workers to raise the money. He was teaching me something. He's an educator. And so we have to think of everybody within this bubble of higher education as our educators. And they're critical in promoting the civic development of students. We also know that there's differences by type of institution. So there's institutions that have formal missions to promote the civic development and engagement of students. When you think of HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities, they have a historical mission to develop leaders. They are, they have a mission, they put their advocacy, their energies towards it, and you see it. In this the last presidential election, a lot of the officials that got elected who identify as black, they were coming from HBCUs. That's not it's not a coincidence. It is something that is developed at these types of institutions. There's also multiple missions that sometimes institutions have, and so community colleges, for example, are a perfect place that they have this formal mission to serve communities, right? They're educating folks, they're providing particular supports for different industries that are in the community and so forth. And so they have this kind of community engaged kind of approach to things. But there's also other types of MSIs that have minority serving institutions like HBCUs who have an impact on students differently depending on where they go. And so part of my prior research, I was looking at, how is there a difference whether a student is attending HBCU versus a HSI versus an NIPZ, which is an Asian serving Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander serving institution. Sorry, it's a really long. It's NIPZ for short. Whether there is any difference. And for his Latinx students in particular, what I found was those who attend HSIs, Hispanic Serving Institutions, there is an impact. What we don't know is to what extent or what about them is really impacting these things. And there is folks that do, and I do research around minority serving institutions, and other folks have found, Garcia in particular, she has focused a lot of her work on demonstrating how it's HSIs, which I'll explain a little bit just to give you a little more context and we're all on the same page with this. For HSIs, you have to have a minimum enrollment of Latinx students, both racial demography enrollment, but also by low-income status. And oftentimes, that is a way that they serve communities, right? Enrolling, providing access, but it's not enough. And so I try to understand these institutions through the lens of civic engagement. So what are they doing? And just to provide a little bit of context, because I'm going to go a little bit deeper about MSIs, I focus a lot on institutions, like what are they doing? And so I mentioned historically black colleges. There's also tribal colleges and universities, Hispanic serving institutions, Asian American, Native American, Pacific Islander serving institutions. These are all federal designations, and there's actually more than this, but these are kind of the big ones that you hear a lot about. What's important to know about these and why it's related to civic engagement, like I said, historically black colleges, they have this historical mission. They are also institutions that have been slated as such. They became HBCUs, they're part of the slate of the federal government, that they are HBCUs, and so they have this historical mission that has really, they were opened like this. Like they had this from the very get-go. They train the highest amount of black doctors in the country. They train the highest amount of black teachers in the country, and so they become really critical sites when we think of civic engagement and actual service sector careers, pursuing roles that really serve the community. Tribal colleges and university also federally slated, so the ones that are, they are. And so those are tribally chartered. Those are folks, these are institutions that have a specific charge to support tribal communities. Not all of them are tribal lands, tribal community reservations, but are somehow connected to different tribal communities. They have the highest number of teachers who identify as indigenous, who are working back in their communities. So I wanted to lay that context because when we look at Hispanic serving institutions, which I'm going to go in a little bit deeper about, the Hispanic, both HSIs and NIPZs are not formally slated. It depends on the demographic enrollment numbers, so this could change, and it's really at 25% full-time enrollment. So at any point, if you're at 24, you're right about there, but you still don't qualify. But then if you're at 25 and 1 year enrollment drops for Latinx students, you're now not, a designated HSI. And so they don't have this historical mission. Not all. Some do. Some started as historically serving Hispanic serving institutions. There's one in New York. There was one in California. But for the most part, these are folks these are institutions that came to be as HSIs. Another important note to know about these institutions is that even though you might meet the demographics, some institutions decide not to apply for this federal designation. They don't want to be labeled as Hispanic serving institution, and that's you can take my classes and you'll find out more. Which I forgot to put a plug in the back. We have graduate admissions if you want to know more about. This is my director role. If you want to know more about the programs, please visit them in the back of the room. So thank you all for being here for that. So what we also know, as related to Latinx civic development and engagement, we know, so I already mentioned that it does look different. Latinx college students are more likely to engage in civic activities most connected to their culture, community, and and in response and in resistance to experiences of marginalization and discrimination. We know that, and for some folks in the room, they might say like, well, yeah, like, duh, like I know that, like, you know, like that's not new news. But you would be surprised at like in terms of like the literature and scholarship around civic engagement, the lack of, or if it's not lack of, even when it is there, sometimes it's seen as in a deficit lens. Like they're not engaged, they're you know, they don't have the civic skills to engage, or like, oh, you know, as related to higher education institutions, like, oh, you know, they're always working, so they don't want to be on campus, they're just coming in and out. And this is common rhetoric that I've worked with colleges across the country, in New York and Washington, Texas, all over the place, and you hear that often, especially in particular institutions that I already said, right, like community colleges are, you know, they're serving community, and that's actually a pretty common rhetoric in community colleges where like, well, you know, they're in and out, they're working, they don't want to be engaged, or they have families, and so, oh yeah, they have other responsibilities. But it's like, oh, I don't know, have you really looked at the data? Have you asked your students, you know? And what opportunities do you have? Do you think that what you do in a residential campus is going to be this, because that's the other thing, literature on civic engagement focuses on four-year colleges that are mostly residential colleges. Residential colleges, as you all know, we're residential, right? We have dorms and so forth. Folks who live here, you're here. I could, you know, there could be programming and you're here. I could do stuff at 10 o'clock maybe, and hopefully you engage, right? Other places that are commuter campus, you have to be intentional and mindful of like the structures. I work with some institutions, for example, in Southern Nevada, you have a community college who offers classes like at 2 a.m. in the morning for folks who work in the casino industry. So that's being intentional and mindful of what they're going to do to serve the community. And so, you know, what are some ways that those classrooms could still provide this civic engagement opportunities and development at the 2 a.m.? Like, why not, right? And so being mindful of those things, right? So overall, I think with the lack or limited or deficit framing of literature, there's also just a history of disenfranchisement. Sorry, I struggle with this word. I always mumble it, or disenfranchisement, help me if I get it wrong, of particular populations, in particular Latinx, like voter suppression laws, voter ID laws, language issues related to voting and all that kind of stuff. You know, there has been structural things that have affected the civic engagement of Latinx communities. And so if we say, oh yeah, they don't want to engage, that's just blaming the community. It's also an illusion of this. Like, yes, I do want to recognize generally presidential elections. There's always, you'll hear this in the news. You're already starting it, but you'll hear it more in this next coming year. Like, oh, we got to get the Latino vote, right? And there's all these like voter campaigns. Let's get the Latino. It's really important. I'm not trying to dismiss that. But like I said, folks don't start with that, right? Like they don't necessarily, and especially if you're coming from communities who have a history that has been history of communities that have been marginalized, group of folks that can't vote, residents, undocumented folks, they can't vote, but it doesn't mean they're not civically engaged. And so saying that there's a lack of, it's just wrong. We got to talk about the structures in play. And so all this leads to like this meta research that I'm trying to understand and explore through different ways of study. And so it's the how. So I already said, we already know that there's differences. We already know that there's an impact depending on what institution you go to. But we know less about the how. How do we engage and how do we develop the civic development of Latinx students in particular? And to promote or hinder the civic development of racial ethnic minority students broadly and Latinx students specifically. I highlight the how, like I said, the promote. We do have, some literature that talks about the hindering, folks who have used archival work, for example, to document some of the policing around of activism and organizing on college campuses. So we know what could hinder, right? But I want to know how do we promote it? Like what are the avenues of opportunity to promote their civic development? And so this is kind of like the meta question. And we know historically, there has been all this engagement with students that have started at college campuses and have really created literal social movements. In these last couple of years, I mean, with the even more increasing rate of access to technology, like literally they're creating not just social movements in the US, but also globally, which is amazing. So I have particular, pictures of like the Greensboro sit-ins, for example. I mean, I think it started with 3 folks, if I remember correct. I'm horrible with like specific details, but I think it started with 3, it ended up 5 students, and then it became like this bigger group, and this was at an HBCU campus. And so I had a chance, if you never had the chance to go visit, the actual seats are at a museum nearby at the original Woolsworth, and it's just an amazing thing to be. And so, but yeah, you have other movements, undocumented students. I mean, where we're at in California, it's because of students. Like that movement was because of students. It started off underground, like as they're organizing, so forth. And now, there's I won't say everywhere, but at least in California, there's a larger support for the student group. But and Dr. Perez, went into this a little bit. I wanted to also kind of back up a little bit so you know who I am and also what brought me to this work. So as was mentioned, I am a daughter of Mexican immigrants. I'm the youngest of 5. I am also I'm first generation, but also first to go to college. I'm the youngest of 5. My oldest brother is 20 years older than I am. Wow. And I have a niece that's 3 years older than me. I know, right? And so I was born with this familial responsibility. Like I was already born an aunt. I was 3, and this is an actual story. I was 4, I was at kinder, and the kids say, "You can't be an aunt." And I said, "Yes, I am." And so I was already born with that. Like I had to do something different. I grew up in a very low-income community of Riverside. My dad, he was one of 16 children, one of the oldest, and he went enough to learn math and like simple math and so forth, but he's one of the most smartest people I know, but didn't get to actually engage in formal education past like what would be considered 3rd grade in Mexico, or 3rd grade here, but it was in Mexico. My mom was set to be a teacher, and that was what she wanted to do, but married my dad, who like didn't really understand the importance of higher education and so forth, and there was just limited opportunities. Like there wasn't those financial supports in Mexico to pursue that route, and they came in the late 60s, early 70s to the United States. So I was born with that responsibility. I felt like I needed to do something different for my family. Even I felt that kind of responsibility growing up. I'm also a product of great educators. So when I emphasize educators, I mean my first awesome experience. You see my kindergarten teacher, that's me and my little kinder graduation camp. Miss Garcia passed away. She was such a great example of a community engaged teacher who went above and beyond her role. Like she was always encouraging the moms to engage in like social actions that were happening in the community, trying to, she up to the point of her passing, like I think she was in her early 80s when she passed. She was teaching English in the local Parks and Rec, and my mom was one of her students after many, many years. And so that's what she did, and so I have those examples, right? So I'm lucky to have that. Not all students have that. But I also was, and these are different pictures of when I was going through college, of me being engaged. And when I said to you earlier, like if you were to have asked me in college, I would have said, no, I'm not engaged. But shoot, I was a track coach for 8 years. That's my runners in the back, hurdles, varsity, boys and girls. I was leading them for 8 years at my high school alma mater, so I was giving back to my community. I was mentoring them. A lot of them I'm still connected to. I look young, but it was a long time ago. I also, that's in the middle, you see my students that I work with, English and math. I work with a majority recent immigrants, like teaching them English and math. I work with Freedom Schools of Long Beach. I work in partnership with the Parks and Rec of Riverside to provide youth track meets. That's my Upward Bound students right here, which I'm also connected to. So through all these different experiences, I was civically engaged. I was giving back, but I wouldn't have thought that just based on what I thought was civic engagement. So I would see things like promoted at UC Riverside, but I just, oh, there's a scholarship for your civic engagement. I wouldn't have thought that. I just thought that's what I had to do. Like, that's part of my responsibility to my community, but no one ever highlighted that to me, right? I was also working like multiple jobs. I didn't have that concept. And so part of the paper, this leads me to what brought me to this type of work is really understanding like a higher education institution's roles and like how do we promote that? How do we get folks who are like me, who come from communities that I identify with, and really like get them to understand and be proud of the things that they're doing, and for institutions to highlight that work. And so in that publication, I propose a model that is informed by the literature. I developed this actually during my dissertation research process. And so what it accounts to, thinking of students in different developmental stages, students don't come to campus that are like, oh, like I have zero civic development, their values or so forth. They're coming with something. So it's taking into consideration the different attributes, the different experiences that they've had. Did you go to a high school that required volunteer hours, for example? Did you work during high school? And where did you work? All these different little things that seem like, oh, like why? But it will have an influence then on how they engage on your college campus. And so this is a model that I propose for higher education institutions, practitioners, researchers, to kind of consider, like, these are the different things to think about as you're developing programming, as you're thinking about, like, how can we institutionalize civic engagement goals for our institution, like what is it that we have to think about. Other things that are important, like for example, immigrant generation, immigrant status, all these different things that come into play in terms of how we view the world, how we engage with the world, but then how we're going to engage with college campuses. Then in the middle block, it's all the environmental, so all the environmental factors. So the things that are students part-time, full-time, are they transfer students? Transfer students, they're coming into our college campuses, but they're coming in 2-3 years, they're coming their junior year. And so are we being mindful of those student populations and how we engage them, not just in like first year seminars and so forth, but actual things for our transfer students. And then it's also what we know more about in terms of the literature is like all the curricular, co-curricular practices. Do we have a Greek life? Do we have one that's focused on particular affinity groups? What are the courses that we have? Do we have a gender studies? Do we have ethnic studies or Chicano studies? Any type of thing like that. Those types of things have an impact on students. And then at the bottom is all the institutional characteristics. So whether it's a public, private, I already mentioned the MSI status, community college versus four-year, all those have an effect on how students will engage. And then the outcomes that I focus on, civic values. So do I have that desire to want to give back? The civic engagement, the behaviors, and service-related careers. What that means is more so like for certificate or degree earning, like required type of careers. Are they aspiring for those things, like doctors, teachers, and so forth? Are they aspiring for those things? So all that. What I want to highlight with the outcomes part is when we're thinking about our practices, what are our outcomes? What are our measures of success? And I'm not saying that you have to have all these three different things, and we could even expand on these things, but what is it that you're going to focus on so that you can measure, are you being successful? If I'm providing this leadership development program, are they really, is it really having an impact on their values, or is it something that's like, they're doing it just to do it, another resume boosting thing, or is it actually changing the way they view the world? Are they being more empathetic? Are they being more engaged? All those types of things. So those things are important. I also put on the outsides is the local, community, national, global, and that kind of relates more to the connection with the global local and the things that Dr. Ramos is spearheading along with Dr. Roberto Espinosa, and really considering these contexts these institutions don't live in a vacuum. Like they're constantly being impacted by local community, national issues, but also global. But not only are institutions being impacted, but so are the students, right? So where are their students, where are the families coming from? Like what are the country of origin? Somebody who's coming from a very politically hostile country may have a different approach to engaging with civic engagement here in the United States. And so we have to consider where folks are coming from and not just assume that they don't want to engage. And so to give you a little bit, I want to make sure I'm mindful of time too. Are we good? Okay. I want to, I think you know, it's kind of big picture of what I'm presenting, like a big model. If you read it, I did provide more examples, right? But I wanted to show you like one piece of kind of the work that's an extension of what you would read about. And so I'm just going to give you a snippet of it. I was able to present during a session with some of my colleagues up here, Sandivel and Lisette, who are also here over at MOX this summer. And so I also wanted to recognize some of my co-authors and collaborators. This is a part of a co-authorship, but it's also a bigger team in terms of co-researchers and are going to be involved in other publications. Did Asalia ever get here? ¿Dónde está Asalia? Oh, aquí está. Okay. One of my students is one of the research associates with this project. I wanted to also highlight and give her a shout out here too. So she's not a part of this paper, she's part of the next paper. And so I wanted to highlight those things. So yeah, so just to give you like, okay, well, you're telling me this big picture, like what does it look like? Like what is it that, you know, why should I care? And why should what's the relevance to this? And so part of, so I'm right now, we're in the process of data collection for a project that's being funded by Spencer. I'm looking at a cluster of public institutions who have this charge. So it's four institutions. 2 are public four-year institutions, 2 are community colleges. All 4 are Hispanic serving institutions. One of them has a dual designation as a HSI and an ANAPISI. And so we're wanting to understand like how these institutions promote the civic development of Latinx students. What are the practices? What are the structures at play? What are the support systems for faculty? What are even the environment? Like I intentionally put these pictures of these murals that are up on college campuses because it promotes something. Like what kind of vibe does it create for the students? What kind of messaging and what leaders are promoted? Do they look like the students that are being enrolled? All those types of things we're looking at in terms of this current study. So it's part of a bigger project. I'm gonna share with you a snippet of it. So this particular study that I'll go more deeply into focused on the data that's coming out of one of the HSI community colleges. It's an institution that is proportionally representative of the local Latinx community. So 68% versus 70%, which means that you have sometimes institutions in certain communities where the community is not represented at those institutions. So technically, it's pretty proportional, like in terms of Latinx enrollment and who is in this particular community. And so you would say like, oh, okay, well, it is Latinx enrolling. It's meeting that threshold. It's you know, it's pretty comparable. But we still need to ask, well, what is it that they're doing? Like, are they just enrolling them, or are they really structuring curriculum and services and opportunities for students that really engage community, that really are responsive to community needs? So we're asking this part of the study is looking at how educators in particular describe the civic development of Latinx college students. I mentioned earlier that sometimes some community colleges I visited, they'll have this very deficit approach to the way they see the civic engagement of community college students, right? And so I wanted to know, like at a place like that, who has 70% students who are Latinx and are representing the community, how would they describe how students are engaged? Would they say that same thing as I've seen at other places, or will they say, yeah, actually they're pretty engaged? And then secondly, what are the actual practices that they're doing to promote this? And so these are based on, data collection is still ongoing, but this is preliminary analysis of 16 of those interviews. And like I said, it was interviews, document analysis, campus observations. Like we literally walked the whole campus observing like, what are the flyers that are there? What kind of like clubs are promoted? We even pictures, like what could we assume based on what we see in the picture of like the representation of administrators, former presidents. You know, you sometimes walk the halls and there's like a list of presidents, like who's there, right? Does it look like the students? And I'm drawing from the model that I shared with you, and also this the conceptualization of servingness that's proposed by Garcia, which highlights what I mentioned earlier, that it's not enough for institutions to enroll, but really, what else are they doing to serve communities? And so I'm going to highlight two particular themes that have come out. This is a pseudonym, so don't look up City of San Manuel, like you're not going to find it. And this is based on IRB. If you've never done research, I have to do that. But you could probably find hints to what it is. But so approximately 70% identify Hispanic or Latino, according to the census. 90% of Mexican descent. So there's a particular amount of group, immigrant group in this community. Approximately 22 foreign born, language other than English. These are all key kind of demographic information that is important for an institution, and seeing like, well, how much of that is represented at this particular college campus. This particular city where this community college resides is one of the highest poverty rates in the country at 20.9%, compared to 11% nationally. Unemployment rate is high. Homelessness high, a lot of folks who are unsheltered, a lot of young kids are unsheltered. In terms of educational attainment rate, 12.7% have bachelor's degrees. In terms of the context of higher ed, you have the community college and then you have a public four-year. But in the surrounding areas, you have plenty of higher education institutions. And so here's where you start questioning, like, okay, well, you have at least 10, you have 12 in that area. And then when I say in the area, I mean like within 30 miles. But yet the rates are so low in terms of college attainment. So, right, what's happening? And so like we start questioning, okay, well, let's see what's going on. In terms of voting, you have 56% of the Latinx in the region who were registered and 50% who voted, compared to 74% and 68% of white residents. And there is, I do want to recognize, there is, in the last like 5 years or so, there is a growing number of leaders who are running for like community elected positions. And so that is really important. Some of them were actually alumni of some of these colleges, which is really great. So I also wanted to see, like, okay, do they know that, or are they following like where their alumni are going, right? So that's one aspect, just to like present the context and see where it's at. And so this is some of the themes that came from the interviews. So these are, again, perceptions of educators on campus, and I'm going to highlight particular quotes. So one of the big pieces that came out, I think, that really, it's coming out in a lot of the interviews with these educators, where they actually do recognize that our students are civically engaged. What's more important, and what should be highlighted, is that they see their students as not just civically engaged in terms of like behaviors. They are doing that too, but they're saying even the act of coming to college every day, because of all the stuff, and I could probably use a different word, but all the stuff that they have to deal with on a daily basis, that's civic engagement. And we have to recognize and highlight those things. So when you think about the student who is working multiple jobs, supporting family, and they're still showing up to class and changing dynamics of their families, it's not just changing a family, it's changing a community, right? Because it trickles out, right? And so they talked a lot about that. they saw they saw that students were, it was very much, their engagement was interconnected with identities and lived experiences. Actually, everybody highlighted one of the most actively, civically engaged members of the student community are actually their undocumented student population. They were very active on campus, very active in the community. When I asked, one of the questions that we ask educators is like, did you notice, what is the difference? So one of the things that, very early on, it was very obvious, right? There was this discussion of how the pandemic has really hit engagement, right? Like how folks engage and ways students want to engage. And all the educators talked about how undocumented students continued to push. They continued, and they had the highest turnout of any events that they had for students. They brought in community members, and so that's really, really important, and something that I want to make sure that we highlight, and I hope that it contributes to the literature of civic engagement. But we also want to recognize the challenges of engagement, right? So in this particular community is also within, I would say, 20-minute drive is one of the largest Amazon warehouses, and so in this context, that presents one of the this is one example of the challenges in terms of engagement. So students are working, they're finding it like, oh, okay, here's a flexible opportunity for me to work extra hours, but it is taking away like their opportunities to engage in things that they want to engage in. There's also a lot of that's a whole nother talk that we could probably have, right? About like Amazon and how they treat workers and so forth like that. And so there's even issues like that where like they're feeling a certain type of way about the work that they're having to do, and many times contradicting kind of their experiences and their ability to be able to engage with their college campuses. And so what are some of the implications for all of this? So that was just an example of some of the things, and again, we're currently in data collection process, interviewing educators, students, and so forth. So we're still collecting some of that, but we do know, and based on the publication that I was also, asked to talk about, is one of the big clear implications is a need for data and theoretically informed decision making as related to civic practices that are critical, that are inclusive, culturally and community responsive. So not just saying like, oh, the literature says doing a service learning opportunity is what helps students and engages them, but really thinking critically about like, well, where are the service learning opportunities? How are we actually organizing these service learning opportunities? Are they engaging with communities and in a respectful, ethical way that really is responsive to what students want to engage with and that they want to, that the community wants to engage with? Related to that is data sharing and transparency. So sometimes the data about like who's engaging is collected, but not always shared with folks who are key. Like I said, educators are key. Does your educator know the demographics of your students? You're already collecting the demographic data, so do they know? But then also paired with that, do they have the professional development to understand what does it mean to be serving a Latinx student? What does it mean? So are you still, using that data to like perpetuate some deficit thinking, or are you really thinking critically about what does it mean to have Latinx students in my classes? Seeing leaders as educators, leaders and partners, which relates to all these things. Seeing the classrooms as critical sites, having meaningful out-of-classroom experiences that are really thoughtful in terms of how students can and will engage. And then another key one that is coming out of the data too from this particular project is making students, Latinx students in particular, feel connected and proud of their community. That's another thing, right? So we could talk about the community and some of the issues that are going on, but then are we talking about like some of the great things that are also happening and their role as leaders and why that's important that they're even there. So in conclusion, higher education institutions play a critical role in the civic development of students. There is a need for institution-wide approaches, like incorporating that's part of the structure, which I know GLA, that's one of the key charges that they're trying to do more here at LMU, which is great. and then importance of using data and theory to inform practice. So with that, I end it, and thank you so much.
Okay. So the outreach team has put together some questions, and so just bear with me with my questions first. Could you speak to how your model might be applied to other minoritized students? For example, what modifications or considerations would you suggest for other faculty scholars who are looking to build on your research?
And that's a great question. I'm glad you asked this. I mean, if you look at the model and just the basics of it, like what are the key demographics, for example, that I propose institutions and educators pay attention to, and I mean across the board, as related to different racial ethnic groups, one example is like their immigrant backgrounds and generations, right? So. I think like that, those are, especially those like pre-college demographics, attributes, characteristics, experiences in high school. I mean, those are, even the experiences in higher ed, like those are also relevant for other racial ethnic groups. And so what the key difference then is like, how do you structure it so that it's responsive to those particular groups, right? So yes, we could say culture responsive practices are important. We know that. But then it's going to be different for Latinx students versus Black students, right? Like but then we also have to think of the nuances, right? So there is Afro-Latinx folks, and so like what are some ways that and this is where to the part of the question of like looking to build on the work is like what are the intersections of these identities and experiences that folks could look at to see, well, okay, if we're going to do culturally responsive, it's not just about particular racial groups, cultural groups, and so forth, but what are some intersecting identities that might impact the experiences coming into college and then the way they experience their college experience. So yeah, that's one way to look at it. This is especially important for MSIs who often enroll not just that key demographic group, but it also provides access to other minoritized populations, right? So like even HBCUs, another big population that is enrolling are Latinx and API students, right? But we don't often hear about that experience at an HBCU. There is one article that focuses, which Dina Maramba, faculty at CJU, has written about in terms of API and Latinx there. But yeah, you know, what are the experiences of different groups on those college campuses with a particular focus of how these structures impact the civic engagement of those students.
And a question that I didn't mention to you, but I'm going to ask you now is, what about role modeling, like from families who are, you know, also civically engaged? How much impact is that on their children?
Yeah, I mean that's one of the attributes. Like what did you see in your family in terms of engagement? Like whether it was voting, whether it was them organizing, participating in protests, whether it's in the United States or wherever, you know, country of family origin. Perhaps they were very civically engaged or held political positions wherever they were at, wherever their country of origin is, and then they just are engaging civically differently here in the United States. Maybe they're still talking to the student about it, right? Asalia, who's in the back, has been doing most of the student interviews actually, and she could probably speak to that. We do ask a question about like, can you tell us where it came from, right? Like and I know just from knowing some of the data, and chime in, Asalia, if you want to. Some students will mention like, well, you know, it was a parent, like they weren't actively engaged, but they were making sure because our family. My mom was undocumented, but I was not, and she made sure I was voting. She made sure she drove me to these things. And this is one of the experiences that I heard of from an educator, actually, about a student that we got to interview. So yes, it has an influence, but even the literature related to how families impact engagement for students, I mean, that needs to be explored even further too. Like that example that I just gave you, that's not always talked about. It's only talked about in terms of like the capitals, right? So do you have money to engage in internships? Do you have, who are your social networks? Is your network a Supreme Court judge? And so then you have direct access, right? It's just a very different experience for minoritized students sometimes. Some do have these particular experiences, but not always.
Right, thank you.
Yeah.
What about LMU? Have you turned your lens of this model onto our own institution?
Yeah.
And if so, where do we fit in this?
So for one thing, I mean, the model is not that like necessarily a cookie cutter type of approach, right? It's really just trying to turn your attention to different things that might impact the civic development. But where we're at, I mean, we have some of the educators here who are doing some amazing work, and that I'm still learning from. I'm fairly new, so I'm entering year 2 of being at LMU. So, being a good researcher, I can't tell you definitively yet. I also haven't gotten IRB approval or interviewed anybody yet. But just from observations, and I want to highlight some of the work that Dr. Ramos is doing and spearheading in terms of engaging more faculty and student study abroad opportunities and engaging in some critical discussions around immigration. And you could talk to her more about this, but she was part of the group organizing a large group of first-gen students engaging in a study abroad opportunity in Germany and having conversations around immigrations and finding connecting points and so forth. We also have Liz back there, who's awesome, and I have her flyer to promote some of the things she's working with. So if you've never met Liz, I encourage you. Our class was able to go check out the work that she does. She's an archivist here at LMU. And so one of the initiatives she's spearheading is the Inclusive History and Images Project, FYI. Like, you should check it out. And what it is that she's really trying to preserve and collect some of the stories of some of the folks from minoritized backgrounds who have came through and have really engaged with our LMU community. So check out that and contribute to the story too if you feel like you want to. I encourage you to do that and be part of that story. So yes, there's a lot of cool things. You have, Upward Bound person, like the person who initiated, she's here with us today. Like, she started Upward Bound here at LMU. And unfortunately she retired, but those are key things that the LMU is doing, that our students are able to engage with, that the community has benefited from, and so forth. So yeah, there's a lot of great things. One of the cool things about LMU that drew me here, and being a newbie, and I know that this is part of the conversations we have, my colleagues who are also kind of fairly new to LMU, is like, there's already this social justice mission that sometimes at other places, I've been at different types of institutions. I've been at the public, private, community college. I've worked in all of them or engaged in research and so forth with them. And, sometimes you even have to explain what social justice is, And so here I don't have to explain that. We just have to go a little bit deeper. Like, what does it mean for different groups, and to what extent are you really being just? So there's still those different layers. It's not perfect, but at least there's a starting point that we could really work with.
Well, and I'm glad that we have good role models like
Yeah.
you and Dr. Perez and others, so thank you. The time is getting short, so I'm going to start asking the audience if you have any questions here, because I think your questions are way more important.
What are your thoughts about the differences between the demands of first-generation immigrant children to second-generation?
Yeah, that's a really interesting. That's why this is partly why it's so important of differentiating immigration status, right? So folks who so for those who may not be as familiar with it, so folks like myself, I'm a second-generation immigrant. My parents were born in Mexico, migrated to the United States. Then I was born here in the United States. So I have U.S. citizenship status, based on birth. And so my experience with the U.S. and engaging is different than my parents, right? My parents, it also matters age of immigration. So my parents came a lot older. So usually a lot of scholars who do immigration work and looking at the way there's differences based on generations in the way folks engage the United States and our social mobility and all that kind of stuff. The cutoff is usually 12. So, and what the difference is that somebody at 12, you're engaging with K-12 more, right, than somebody who comes over the age of 20 and is not engaging in school. In K-12, you are required to learn about government, U.S. history. And so then you might have a different orientation and understanding of politics and government and your role in it compared to somebody like my parents, right? And so just that alone, there's a difference. So depending on age, and so for someone like myself who grew up with that, the schools became kind of that source of knowledge and information, right? The educators that I engage with, as compared to my parents, who later in their years became naturalized U.S. citizens. They were residents at first, and so there's differences in that way. So right, immigration status, but then generation in terms of as interrelated also, or intersecting with age of arrival. That creates differences, and usually one of the key ones is education. Yeah, and we could expand on more.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah.
Anybody else have a question?
My question is related to, typically in certain ethnic groups and diverse groups, people have obligations to family or work, or they're doing other things while they're also in school. Do you find that kind of those obligations affect their civic engagement in any way, or is it something where they're able to manage at the same level? How does that kind of affect what they're doing?
Well, that's where it becomes, they may be engaged, but differently, right? So if you just were to say that, and this is part of kind of the narrative when I visit campuses, sometimes they'll say, well, especially community college, right? Oh, they have all these responsibilities. They don't want to engage. So why are we going to promote these things? Where are we going to put our resources? Maybe not there, because they don't want to. So we're just going to provide, these other things that they need or want, or so forth. But I would push back on that, because just because and I'm a product, I was working multiple jobs. I was, responsible for things as related to my parents who are a lot older. But it didn't mean I wasn't engaged. You might just engage a little bit differently. So it might mean that, okay, well, they're not going to be able to volunteer because they work more than 40 hours, for example. But hey, now with social media, they're information sharing. Maybe they shared a news article about something that happened in their community. That's civic engagement, right? And so are they having, we're assuming this is particularly, potentially like a college student taking classes. Okay, well, this is where the class becomes really critical. So that's where they are going, they are learning. And so as instructor engaging with issues that are happening in the community, that, hey, now I'm going to go back home and I'm going to talk to my mom about that. And translate it in a language that she understands of what's going on, and maybe bring her with me when we're going to go hear what's happening in the community forum about what's going to happen in our community, right? And so there is forms, and so it's more about how do we what do we recognize, and are we even recognizing that as a form of civic engagement? And that's what I'm trying to promote and push for, is we have to have it more broader definition of what it is, and then really make sure that we're highlighting those approaches, and the students know that you are civically engaged, you are a leader, and that also will potentially inspire future engagement when they can engage. Right?
This might be a little bit loaded, but
Okay.
what would you expect, right? You mentioned there was a question about LMU in particular. And LMU has been, for at least 20 years, on the verge of, in quotes, HSI status. So if LMU were to become an HSI, how do you think that would, what would you see in terms of engagement for Latino students? How might that change the landscape for all students? Just what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, to be honest, there's still ways to get there, right? And so demographically, by race, we might be inching towards that. But I don't know if you all saw the rankings of LMU and where we stand socioeconomically, and we're pretty low, right? So part of the federal formal designation is you also have to meet the 50% minimum requirement of low income. And usually federal government uses the Pell Grant eligibility as a metric, but there's other ways to get this metric or meeting this metric. There's also, I will also highlight that there is emerging HSI designations that maybe that's something to explore, where you don't meet those cutoffs, but you know that you're planning towards it. So what is important though is these early conversations, because at the very, so just one, starting those conversations, but then seeing what do we already have. Like there is things that are happening that are, I mean, just what you all do, right? Like what are with Upward Bound, what are we doing in the community? What is the role of LMU there? What are the resources and connections that we're providing? Is that an avenue to increase, like are your students, are the students that we're serving through the different touches, not just Upward Bound, but if we think of our teacher preparation programs, right? They're going off into the field teaching at under-resourced schools or highly, in particular institutions that might have a high enrollment of Latinx students in particular, for example. Are those students then enrolling here at LMU? Are they here? We could ask those questions. Why are they not? So then is it something related to information? Folks who live even in the community sometimes haven't even stepped foot on this campus, right? And so can they see themselves here? And so that also even relates to, like, as a campus, what are some things that we need to change or include or add to make students feel like they belong, that they can come here? So I think the initial early and very early kind of conversations is a good place to start. Being in LA, like most institutions in LA, they meet the demographic enrollment at the very least. The economic enrollment part of it, that's the tricky part, because of like selectivity, like who has the ability to pay, who has the information, the college knowledge about applying. Private institutions in particular add another layer, right, with the Common App. Do folks know how to do that? Do they know how to navigate the letters of rec? Do they know how to navigate their experience in relation to why they are a strong candidate in their admission statements? And so there's still a lot of inequities when it comes to, like, why are they not even here yet, even though demographically they're here, right?